welcome to That's So Hindu, the podcast brought to you by the Hindu American Foundation. I'm Matt McDermott. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr Pankaj Jain, professor at Flame University in India and head of the India Center there. He's been on the show several times now, and today we're talking about the unknown Ambedkar. That is how B.R. Ambedkar's views on Hinduism are far more complex and heterodox than today's caste activists often portray them. We also discuss a bit about the origins of the Indian social categories that get lumped together under the word caste, as well as the highly complex ways these categories influence Indian society today across all religious affiliation. Hope you enjoy it. Well, Pankaj, thanks for joining us. It seems like it's becoming a yearly thing. Last time, I think it was about this time of year, we were talking about Hindu parenting. We're here to talk about something entirely different today. We're here today to talk about what I like to call the unknown Ambedkar. But before we get into that unknown part, for those that are just coming to the topic, not all our listeners may be fully aware. Can you give them a brief overview of who Ambedkar was, both in terms of shaping the modern nation of India and, of course, caste, which is, he's an icon of anti-casteism, all of these things.
Right, sure. So this conversation was transpired when I reached out to Matt and HAF that I want to share some new research that I have been doing and collecting a lot of information about Varna Vyavastha or Varna system, Jati Vyavastha or caste system as it is popularly now known in India and worldwide. Whenever India is mentioned, caste is attached to India, or Hinduism cannot be separated without caste, right? So cannot be mentioned without caste, right? So and Ambedkar, as we all know, is largely known worldwide, of course in India and now worldwide, because he is known as one who framed the Indian Constitution that was released in 1950. And we are, coincidentally, we are approaching Jan 26th, which is when Indian Constitution was released. And he's considered one of the main writers. He was not the only one. He was part of a large team, but he's credited with writing or compiling the Constitution of India, which he and his team based many ideas they took from Hindu text, Hindu Smritis, Manusmriti, and many others. But today he has, like you mentioned, like you alluded to, today he has become an icon of caste identity in India, Dalit movements in India that are sometimes becoming very, bickering that goes on social media because of the caste-based antagonism and politicized identities and so on. So I wrote an overview of the Varna system, Jati Vyavastha and so on Huffington Post many years ago, actually, but it's still available on Huffington Post. If you just Google for Pankaj Jain caste system, Huffington Post, you will see that article in which I've shared many, many references from Hindu texts. And I've tried to show how Varna was a flexible category where people change their Varna all the time, Vasishtha, Valmiki, Vishwamitra, many, many more, and so on. So that article is already available on Huffington Post. And then this new research that I compiled from various sources, online and offline, printed and online sources, which Matt wanted me to share through this webinar. So here I am.
No, that's a good nutshell. There's another thing in there, though, before we actually get into this unknown part. I just want to make sure we, check all the boxes for people. Can you go into the different social categories that get lumped together, that have gotten lumped together under the name caste? Because, of course, caste isn't an Indian word at all. But there are a number of categories that have gotten combined. And can you go into those, as well as the history a little bit of how those terms have been used, been put forth?
Of course. Yeah. So as we all know, Varna was first alluded in the Rig Veda, specifically in the Purush Sukta 1090, in which the four Varnas are mentioned, although the word itself is not mentioned, but the categories are. So these are Brahman, Kshatriya are mentioned as Rajanya, Vaishya and Shudra, right? And we all know very widely, everybody knows that Brahmins are referring to the spiritual teachers, priests and scholars. Kshatriyas or Rajanyas are the rulers and warriors. Vaishyas are the traders and entrepreneurs. Shudras are the service folks, which should include doctors and engineers and plumbers and electricians, Whoever is selling their knowledge, their skill, their qualification for money are all Shudras. Whoever are giving their wisdom, their knowledge away for free are all Brahmins. That is my simple definition. So Varna is a one major category. And to continue answering Matt's question without getting into too many tangents here, then next major category that we need to recognize is, of course, Jati. Jati, in my opinion, and I think many scholars would agree, that Jatis are, in a way, they are product of intermixing of many Varnas. So if a Brahmin married a Kshatriya, a new Jati was formed, and so on. And in all combinations, in all four Varnas, can have many Jatis. Many scholars have also shown that the original indigenous communities, which are many times it is called as tribes or Janajatis, right, or Adivasis, they became Jatis. They eventually became Jatis. So even though today they are called as scheduled tribes, the indigenous communities are in India, Indian government, Indian constitution calls them scheduled tribe, or in the Indian pronunciation, scheduled tribes, are now, later on, many of those tribes, quote unquote, became Jatis. So just as the tribes practiced endogamous rules for marriage alliances, Jatis continue with the same tradition of endogamous alliances for matrimony, for marriages. So intercaste marriages are shunned, are sort of taboo, because the original tribes, the indigenous communities, world over, not just in India, they all practice endogamy. That is why intercaste marriages are frowned upon by all Jatis in India. So-called lower caste, so-called other backward caste, so-called forward caste, everybody shuns intercaste marriages. So that's another major category of Jati, in which I connected with tribe or indigenous communities. So how many categories we have called? Varna in the Rig Veda, coming from the Rig Veda, then Jatis, then tribe or Janajati or indigenous communities, right? Then we have, of course, the most important or most widely prevalent category called caste. Caste word itself, now widely known, is the word coming from Portuguese. It's not an Indian word. Caste word was first most likely coined by British colonial administrators, Mr. Risley, or quote unquote Sir Risley, who first came up with this idea of census of Indians. And he wanted to force upon these caste category, upon the very flexible Varna Jati system that was prevalent for thousands of years in India. But because of the census by Risley, a new category was forced upon Indians, as widely shown by Professor Nicholas Dirks, pioneered in his book called Castes of Mind, came out in about 2 decades back, more than 2 decades back, from Princeton University Press. So caste is the now most widely used politicized tool, weapon, whatever you want to call it, where the so-called lower castes are always criticizing against casteism at the same time as they continue to advocate for more caste-based reservations across the jobs, across educational institutions, all kinds of opportunities that are given by the central government in India, Delhi, or state governments in India, or local governments in cities across India. Everybody wants caste-based reservation. They want to move, quote unquote, down to lower caste, so just so that they can get more benefits for jobs, for education. At the same time, they vehemently criticized casteism as if it was forced upon them somehow, but they are trying to force upon themselves now to gain more access to more opportunities. So it's a very weird, very paradoxical, complicated situation in India, and it's not going anytime soon. In jobs, in education, in politics, it will remain extremely active term for decades to come. In my how long I can see future. But all political parties today are promoting it, including the BJP, the mainstream party in government now for over a decade now, and all parties, not just BJP, Congress, Aam Aadmi Party, all party, communist parties. Everybody wants to give more reservation to caste-based community categories. Yeah, so these are the main categories, Matt, to answer completely. Yes.
2 things on that. One for listeners. If you want to really nerd out on all these British censuses from the 19th century, they are actually all available online. You can go in and read it in the original documents. It's I think is actually pretty fascinating reading and illuminating on how all of this came into being. I have one question that's outside of my normal thing that brought my normal list there that came out. In these caste-based reservations, it's interesting that we're talking about this. It's January 24th, and in the United States, the inauguration of Donald Trump for his second term just happened, and he just basically, in a stroke of an executive order, did away with many DEI trainings and stuff at the federal level, which it has eerie resonance with caste-based reservations and thinking about forwarding identity in such a strong way. But that's a different podcast. But the question I had is, in all these groups advocating for different places within the reservation system, the discrimination, it seems to me, isn't actually based on Varna, although it overlaps. It's based on Jati. But yet, when it comes to the language of caste advocacy and activism in the United States, it's all about Varna. We talk about Brahmins versus Dalits almost exclusively. Nobody talks about the other three in the middle of this. Do I have that right? Because it really seems like that. I mean, there's obviously overlap between Varna and Jati, but as you alluded to, there have been many people who have moved around in their Varna, there have been intermarriages and all these things. So do I have that right? I mean, the discrimination really seems to be based on Jati more than Varna.
In my understanding, the quote unquote discrimination, the reason I'm putting in quotes is that discrimination is now, like I was alluding to, it is being forced upon all castes. Everybody wants to highlight they want to quote unquote lower down their caste. So aren't they forcing more discrimination upon themselves and their future generations? Because nobody wants to be Brahmin or Kshatriya or Vaishya. Everybody wants to lower down to so-called lower caste, so that they can get more benefits in jobs and in educational opportunities, which are highly competitive. Millions and millions are applying for these jobs, applying for engineering college admission seats, which are extremely limited. So more they can force these discrimination, quote unquote, upon themselves, more easily they can get access to these educational and employment opportunities. And this quote unquote discrimination is not just between Brahmins and quote unquote Dalits, but Brahmin, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas are all categorized under general categories, GC, or open categories or general categories. So that is the least beneficial category when it comes to applying for jobs and educational opportunities. So it's not just Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishyas are all general categories. Nobody wants to be in general. Everybody wants to be in OBC, that is other backward caste, or scheduled caste, that is SC, or scheduled tribe, ST. OBC, SC, and ST. They get the chunk of the reservation. In some states, around 70% of seats are permanently reserved in government colleges, government job-giving offices, where only SC, ST, and OBC can apply for those seats and can get those seats. So general people, that is Brahmin, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, are prohibited from ever getting into those seats. I hope I could clarify that.
That was informative. And I promise I will get to actually my list of questions. For listeners in the US or somehow have come across this show and have coming across this issue of caste for the first time, there isn't a direct correlation that can be made between so-called upper caste, being Brahmin, and lower caste necessarily, and economic levels, correct? I mean, there are Brahmins that are very poor. There are people that are so-called lower caste Shudras or Dalits who have made a good deal of money, and even in the highest levels of government have made it up to the top. I have that correct?
Yes, absolutely correct. It's not at all by economic status whatsoever. It is fixed caste identity from generations behind them, past, and generations in future will continue to reap these benefits just because of their surname, their last name. Last names are called as surnames in India. So just because they were born in certain family lineage, they get all the benefits, all the privileges, all the reservations because of their caste identity that was forced upon them more than a century back, like I was alluding to, by Sir Risley during the colonial times. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Nothing to do with economic status. Yes.
I think that's important to note because sometimes in the US, when we talk about it, there seems to be a correlation among civil rights groups sometimes that are trying to map that onto economic class. And I'm glad we've cleared that up. That's not necessarily the case. So back to Ambedkar. He adopted Buddhism. He's sometimes taken today by both anti-caste activists who are positively motivated by his legacy and Hindus who sometimes come into the crosshairs of these activists, entirely unwittingly sometimes, as he being anti-Hindu. But that's not entirely true. He had problems with parts of Hindu Dharma, but also found inspiration in others. Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely correct. So let's try to revise our own thoughts about Dr. Baba Saheb Bhim Rao Ambedkar. Baba means sort of a fatherly figure. It's coming from Marathi language. Saheb is like respectful word. Baba Saheb, Dr. Baba Saheb Bhim Rao Ambedkar. He was born in quote unquote low caste, and he did feel some kind of discrimination apparently. But then he ended up in Columbia University, my alma mater also, by the way, where you're also located in New York. So he also came to New York. He went to Columbia, got his PhD in most likely, I think, law department or legal studies, something to do with legal studies. I forget the exact PhD topic. But he did study in the US, in New York, in Columbia University. He also went to UK. And he came up with his own sort of theory, quote unquote theory, which he called Indianized pragmatism. Later on in his life, he did convert to Buddhism. He did leave Hinduism, quote unquote, leave. He got converted to Buddhism because so his nationalism prevented him apparently from converting to Christianity or Islam, which he treated as if, or which is true also. They came from outside to India. So he wanted to stick to an Indian tradition. So he chose Buddhism.
But can I just interject that? It just occurred to me that but for today, in today's discourse, people who are uplifting Ambedkar normally would be profoundly anti-Hindutva.
Yes,
which would actually his categorization of what religions and traditions are indigenous to India versus external actually align with Safakar and all the early people of Hindutva. Again, another podcast, but it's just, I think it's important to point out to leaders.
Very important footnote, which thanks for highlighting that. Yes, so today, most of the anti-upper caste or pro-Dalit activists would highly likely that they will align with Christian leaders or Muslim leaders, and they will, of course, vehemently attack Hindutva leaders. That is, of course, absolutely correct. So thanks for pointing that out, Matt. Even though Dr. Ambedkar, like you said, he intentionally avoided Christianity or Islam when he was looking for an alternative to Hinduism. Yes, that's absolutely correct. Right. So coming back, so Buddhism, he called it a religion of values, quote unquote. And in his words, Buddhism, I'm quoting now, he said, Buddhism is more moral and rational than Christianity, Islam, or Hinduism, in Dr. Ambedkar's opinion. And again, in his words, he chose Buddhism as his version of liberation theology. Same liberation theology that helped apparently in Latin America when Christian leaders protested against colonialism. Here, that same idea, Buddhism wanted to sort of import that idea and package with Buddhism and use it for social upliftment of his fellow low caste people, right? So liberation theology, very interesting. What he said was this Buddhism-based liberation theology is better than violent Marxism. Even though today most of these activists would align with Marxist thoughts, but Dr. Ambedkar himself categorically rejected Marxism. Very important to note. Then he said, now there are two sects of Buddhism, largely speaking, Theravada and Mahayana, Theravada or Mahayana. Dr. Ambedkar said, Bodhisattva ideal of Mahayana is better than Theravada's individualism because, of course, Bodhisattva ideal is coming from Mahayana, which combines wisdom with compassion. Theravada lacks this compassion ideal, so he chose Mahayana. That's just another footnote. And very interestingly, he he sort of used these scientific words or academic phrases to replace Buddhist terms, such as nirvana or nirvana. He translated that by calling it scientific rationality. Karma, he called it theory of causation. Prajna, all these Buddhist terms coming from Pali or Prakrit languages, Indian word terms, he translated them very interestingly. Prajna, he called it rational wisdom. Karuna, he called it social justice. So notice how he's playing around, toying with these words and making them again as tools for his social upliftment campaign for his fellow low caste people.
Just one second. Yeah. Sorry to keep interjecting, but there's so many fascinating things in this. I've seen parallels there between what he was trying to do in sort of renaming things with what you actually saw from the 1990s through today, where Hindu concepts, Buddhist concepts are taken out of the original language and are given English terms or giving new things to try to make them more appealing to people who might be turned off by or not understand what the word karma or karuna means. Because it's almost in karuna, it's not a direct translation, but it's a slight leap.
Correct. So that happens even today. So keep interjecting me and keep adding these very important footnotes. Very, very important to note. Yes, absolutely correct. So I was going to say that this next sentence that I'm going to share with all, I think captures this unknown Ambedkar that you're trying to title this webinar with. So very interestingly, Dr. Ambedkar was a critic of Manusmriti, that we all know, everybody knows that, but he was an admirer of Upanishads. He appreciated the Hindu philosophy. Upanishads being the foremost text of Hindu philosophy was really dear to Dr. Ambedkar. He was not a wholesale sort of, what should I say? He did not hate Hindu philosophy as such. He admired Upanishads, but he criticized Manusmriti. He was a critic of the Manusmriti, but not of Upanishads. Very interesting to note. Also, to continue this unknown Ambedkar thing one more time, a little bit further, he was against the Aryan invasion theory. He did not believe that all Indians or all original Indians, so-called Aryans or Arya people, Aryas, did not come all from outside India. He believed that Aryas or Aryans in English were indigenous Indians. They did not come from outside. They were not Central Asians or coming from elsewhere, but they were all indigenous Indians. A position that today most of the Indian or Hindutva affiliated scholars take the same position. Dr. Ambedkar would find very comfortable to align. He did find this very comfortable to align with what Hindutva affiliated scholars today would say the same thing, that Aryas were indigenous, Aryans were indigenous Indians. And also to continue the same thing, to further on this line, Dr. Ambedkar, very much like today's BJP government led by Narendra Modi, he was against Article 370. He supported or he advocated that Jammu and Kashmir was and is an integral part of India. So Article 370 should be abolished, something very recently Narendra Modi's government, BJP government has done. So these two ideas, Dr. Ambedkar being Aryan invasion theory, Dr. Ambedkar being against the Article 370, puts him very, very interestingly with the BJP aligned ideas.
So I believe he's also in support of the Uniform Civil Code, which...
Exactly, that's my next line.
Let's explain that for people, because this one's... the last two things, Aryan invasion theory, well, it's an academic discussion. Article 370, abrogated, I believe is the word, it's an odd word, by BJP several years ago now. I think I have pandemic brain still, and that was a while ago. But Uniform Civil Code, still, it's been a platform point of the BJP and been advocated for a while, but it hasn't been enacted. So what's the Uniform Civil Code? And Ambedkar was in favor of this.
He was in support of the Universal Civil Code, something that is still being championed by the BJP government led by Narendra Modi, which is still not yet fully implemented across India. Only in a couple of states. I think Uttarakhand recently implemented Universal Civil Code with extremely violent or extremely vehement protest by many parties such as Congress and Communist parties and so on. But the BJP is trying to promote that Universal Civil Code across India, something that Dr. Ambedkar promoted while he was alive back in 1950s and so on. Yeah. So very, very interesting.
Yeah, I'm afraid some listeners may not understand what we're talking about here when we're talking about UCC. So basically, what this would be is one set of secular laws, regardless of religious identity, that apply to everyone in India. Unlike now, where for some matters, there's separate law systems for Muslims and other communities. Is that correct?
Correct. Absolutely correct. Yeah. So Muslim personal law is a separate law for Muslim communities. But the Universal Civil Code will abolish all these personal laws for different religious groups. So religious groups such as including Muslims, and I think probably many others, or many other political parties certainly, are opposing this Universal Civil Code, something that Dr. Ambedkar wanted to promote across India. Yes, exactly.
Well, on that one, I've always had a hard time wrapping my head around the logic of using that, and at the same time saying India should be a secular state and is a secular state, but by saying we shouldn't have that. You know, it boggles my mind, to be honest.
Separation of church and state, right? The proverbial separation of church and state that has never happened fully in India, even today. Even today, there is no one law across the land. There are separate Muslim personal law, for example, that is against the Universal Civil Code. Absolutely, yes.
You mentioned, going back a little bit, you mentioned the two main divisions within Buddhism, Mahayana and Theravada Buddhism. But there's also floating around out there what sometimes is called Neo-Buddhism.
Right.
Can you go into Ambedkar's affiliation, connection, inspiration for that and how that differs for our listeners?
Yes, Neo-Buddhism, of course. I think we can call Dr. Ambedkar being the founder of Neo-Buddhism. Today, among all the Indian states, Maharashtra, the birth state of Dr. Ambedkar, has the largest number of Buddhist practitioners. But these Buddhists are largely politicized Buddhists. Their life, I don't think, is around the Buddhist practices or doing more meditation, right? Or practicing more mindfulness. This Buddhism is heavily politicized, again, based on the caste identity, something that was heavily promoted by Dr. Ambedkar. So Neo-Buddhism, I would just call it a political movement, in my humble opinion. I could be wrong. I mean, I've not done exact, deep, thorough research, but in my general overview, this is what Neo-Buddhism represents, or Mahayana, which was around 5 centuries after the Buddha passed away. Theravada, which was the original Buddhism as practiced and preached by the Buddha. Mahayana today is practiced heavily in China, Japan, and Northern Asian countries. Theravada, earlier name was Hinayana or inferior vehicle, is now practiced in Southern Asian countries such as Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. But then there is also Vajrayana, which is practiced in Tibet, and now this Navayana, which was founded by Dr. Ambedkar, which is largely a politicized movement.
And largely based in India or within the Indian diaspora?
Largely based in Maharashtra only, yes.
Oh, in Maharashtra only.
In my observation. Okay. Yes.
That's a good deal right there. But what else in your recent research on caste would you like to share with listeners? I know prior to this we went over
many more, not even scratch the surface. There's so many more.
Well, I mean, if there's so much more beneath the surface, give people a glimpse. What else have you found that's worthwhile sharing? Yes. We have a few minutes.
Okay. We're already out of time.
No, we're not out of time. You have plenty of time to go into things, but I just want to give some shape to the discussion here.
Yes. Right. So like I was earlier alluding to, this Risley who did this first census, caste-based census for all Indians, Dr. Ambedkar, very interestingly, because Risley wanted to divide Indians among North Indians versus South Indians, Eastern states versus Western states, Dr. Ambedkar vehemently opposed it. So look at this research now. This Risley came up with so-called race science. He was probably the most racist administrator in this British administration. So he was an exponent of race science. He used the ratio of the width of a nose to its height to divide Indians into Aryans and Dravidians, that is North Indians versus South Indians, and 7 castes: Brahmin, farmer, shepherd, artisan, trader, warrior, and leader/king. The nasal index was a method of classifying ethnicity based on the ratio of a nose's breadth to height. Narrow noses, types 1 to 5, indicated European origin, so-called upper caste. Medium noses are the yellow races in between. Broad noses were either African origin people, or Melanesians, or Australian aborigines. Now look at Dr. Ambedkar's vehement opposition to all this nonsense. What he said, I'm quoting Dr. Ambedkar from 1948. Quote, the measurements establish that the Brahmin and the untouchables belong to the same race. From this, it follows that if the Brahmins are Aryans, the untouchables are also Aryans. If the Brahmins are Dravidians, the untouchables are also Dravidians. If the Brahmins are Nagas in northeastern state of Nagaland, the untouchables are also Nagas. Such being the facts, the theory, this nasal theory, must be said to be based on a false foundation. So, in other words, Dr. Ambedkar saw entire India, all Indians belonging to the same one race, not Aryan versus Dravidians or whatever nonsense that the British administrators wanted to force upon this. But unfortunately, very ironically, very, very sadly, even today, this Aryan versus Dravidian conflict is extremely politicized, and all the time, politicians are giving statements, especially coming from Tamil Nadu. They're always giving statements as if everything Hindu is all Aryan. So we will oppose it tooth and nail. Many, many times they're saying that let there be death to Sanatan Dharma. It is like dengue disease which should be eradicated. All these statements are given by political leaders in Tamil Nadu without realizing that as vocal critic of caste issues as Dr. Ambedkar, he opposed this divide between Aryans versus Dravidians. Very, very interesting. I thought that I will share that. Right?
Yeah, I think that is, it's very interesting to me because going, I don't know, it's slightly off that is another association is that Ambedkar says Aryan invasion theory is nonsense, that Aryan Dravidian divide doesn't exist, at least in the way that activists today and politicians today would have it. But how many of those same activists would denounce colonialism, would denounce all these things, but yet the very divide that they're trying to highlight between Aryans and Dravidians originates in what we now know scientifically in DNA and all of these things to be falsehood. This divide doesn't exist, at least at the level that they think it does.
Correct. It's very, very important. All right, let's continue our unknown Ambedkar.
Yes, please.
Unknown Ambedkar. So now I'm showing how Dr. Ambedkar admired some of the Hindu texts. So here I go. Ambedkar's Constituent Assembly speech from 24th February 1949. Quoting Dr. Ambedkar, among the 137 Smritis, Yajnavalkya and Manu are of a higher standard. Manu states that daughters have a right to 1/4 of inheritance, unquote. So here it shows he found something of value even from the Manusmriti, which at other times he criticized Manusmriti, but he also found something positive. Again, he was not painting all these texts in one sort of wrong color or hateful color, but he found these positives even in Manusmriti. Now, quoting next. Dr. Ambedkar noted the Bhagavad Gita as the inspiration for his Mahar Satyagraha. He's doing this Satyagraha for, I guess, social equality, but he's quoting the Bhagavad Gita. So he also admired the Bhagavad Gita. Dr. Ambedkar referred to the Manusmriti and other Smritis for drafting the Hindu Code Bill in the Indian Constitution, released on January 26, 1950. And he says, in his Siddharth College speech, January 11th January 1950, he says, I used Manusmriti for caste determination, Parashar Smriti for divorce laws, right? Talaq, divorce, separation of the marriage, Brihaspati Smriti for women's rights, and Manusmriti for inheritance rights. So as he was writing this constitution, he and his team, he was using these material from the Hindu texts. This is coming from his collected speeches, volume 8, pages 17 and 18. Next, in his Rajaram Theatre speech, 25th December 1952, he says, my bill's critics claim it abandons Hindu scriptures. I challenge them to find a clause unsupported by Manusmriti. Women's property should go to daughters after death, just as brothers inherit the fathers. This is the source for this is Janata in 3rd January 1953. So Dr. Ambedkar is using Hindu text, quoting from Hindu text to advocate women's inheritance rights, daughters' inheritance rights, just as many Islamic scholars would do today, I guess, quoting from Islamic texts. Dr. Ambedkar was doing the same thing from quoting from the Hindu text. So that is another, I think, sort of part of this unknown Ambedkar thing. So this completes the Ambedkar section from what all I collected.
Yeah, it seems to me that his impression that he's anti-Hindu, it's entirely wrong. It seems to me he's taking what he sees as the best parts of various Hindu texts, whether those are Smritis or Upanishads, different category of literature, and then rejecting the rest, which is to me a rational approach to things. One does not need to live their life by laws and social customs that are, a couple thousand years old. So it's very, I find that it's much different than the impression given of Ambedkar that gets put across.
Exactly. So Ambedkar is now today being misused, or I guess, used or misused, in sort of really highly politicized debates and highly politicized attacks on, I guess, so-called upper caste Hindus or Hindus or whatever. But Dr. Ambedkar himself was extremely careful, very scholarly, and very careful critic of Hindu text. Yeah, that's what I want to highlight in all these aspects.
Well, that was great. What else is there in your research that you'd like to highlight that people can find out more? Where might people be able to find out more about this?
Yes, I would like to share with everyone that the Pew Trust in the US, they came to India in 2020, about 3-4 years back, and did a wide-scale research involving thousands of Indians across India. What they found is so interesting. They found that Indians so just highlighting from all those charts, Indians in lower castes largely do not perceive widespread discrimination against their groups. And they have shared all this data. You can easily Google for all these data. So that this discrimination is not exactly found among the so-called lower caste people. Very interesting, right? Then most Indians today say it is crucial to stop intercaste marriages across all castes. So again, there is no discrimination sense around the prohibition of around the prohibition of intercaste marriages. Then, relatively few Indians, including people of lower caste, say that they say that there is no discrimination. So I already shared that. Then, the caste issues or caste categories are now heavily entrenched into all Indians, including Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, and so on. This identity has become very, very prevalent, even though there is no discrimination, even though they don't perceive any discrimination. All the time, Indian government is adding more and more castes, like I was saying, they're moving from upper caste down to OBC, that is other backward caste, or lower caste. So that is happening across India. So much so that only 30% of Indians today identify as general caste or Brahmin, Kshatriya, or Vaishya caste. Rest, everybody has moved to OBC or even lower, quote unquote, lower caste. Then Islam, Indian Muslims have their own caste categories. There's a lot of information on that. Then there are big list of Dalit multi-millionaires, even billionaires. As many as 40 names I found. They are all great entrepreneurs today, flourishing today. They're creating jobs and so on. So Dalits as being perennially oppressed is again a big stereotype that we can, I guess, discuss in elsewhere. So that is another. Then the so-called caste crimes is again a very highly politicized myth that has been created by activists. Most of the crimes that are called caste crimes are actually crimes within the same caste category. So maybe the scheduled caste SC person may commit some crime against fellow SC person, or ST person may commit some crime against fellow ST person, but it will come into the news as if an so-called upper caste person has done some crimes against so-called lower caste person. That is again heavily politicized, media-based. Media wants to sensationalize all crimes into caste crimes, but they are not caste crimes. They are normal crimes that happen across all societies. Then these job-based categories are also a lot of miscommunication, misconceptions are present across media. Most of the so-called sewage jobs are not exactly reserved for so-called lower caste people. Again, there's a lot to discuss that. Maybe we'll discuss in an article elsewhere. And all these, a lot of other information ahead. But I guess let's wrap up by saying that most of the issues that are popular or notorious in Western academia are all heavily sensationalized, politicized issues that may not have actual ground reality at all, which I'm learning as I'm now living in India for the last 4 years. I've discovered in my newly found these facts and figures. Happy to share in another article or so, or maybe a webinar or a podcast.
That was great. No, thank you so much. Yes, let's also do an article about some of those stats that you've shared with me previously. And I do think you need to sort of see them in their tables to really get a handle on this.
True.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll talk again, hopefully less than a year from now.
Yes. Thank you, Matt. And always a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, that's it for this episode of That's So Hindu. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it now with someone who you think will like it too. Please also like, follow, and/or subscribe to this show on whatever platform you're listening to it on. You can help ensure that more of these get made by making a donation to HAF at www.hinduamerican.org/donate. Thanks again for listening.